Hello and welcome to PMI's Uncommon Sense podcast, tools to improve your work forever. I'm Susanna Clark, Managing Partner with PMI, the performance improvement consulting and training firm. Our Uncommon Sense podcast is a 15-minute conversation with our expert consultants. They talk a lot of common sense, although much of it is not common practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. We want you to be inspired to improve your business through learning more about the tools which can help you succeed and grow. So I'm joined by Niall Coney again, which is great to have you back. Thank you, Niall, for joining me.
Always happy to be here.
Today, we're going to talk about data collection. Now, I can imagine that for some people, they may groan at this because it can feel like a bit of an uphill climb, can't it? So what I'd like you to do is help us think a bit more about data collection and talk about A, why it's important, and B, some of the strategies for doing that.
How I tend to introduce this is in Lean Six Sigma, we always talk about we're going to use data and we're going to use statistics. And the fundamental principle behind it is when we go into the realm of inferential statistics, without trying to overcomplicate it, is that rather than try and collect tons and tons and tons of data that's effectively going to tell us the same thing, well, if I can collect just a bit of that, i.e. a sample, well, I can use statistics to now branch out or disassemble that sample and tell me what's happening between the lines. So effectively, it's trying to save you time and energy at the end of it by saying if you can collect data in an appropriate way, not only is it going to be useful for whatever you're looking at, but also it's going to save you time in collecting the data if you do it in a thoughtful way. So fundamentally, yes, we can use data, but actually the importance of collecting it is, one, to make sure it's going to be accurate. So when we talk about measurement systems, making sure your measurement system is accurate, making sure it's reliable and trustworthy, giving you something that's actually going to be useful and reflective, and also making sure you're not wasting your time collecting tons of data that's just going to tell you the same story as well. Keep it simple.
Yes. Don't people worry sometimes that they might miss something if they've only collected a sample?
It quite commonly, and it all comes down to how well you did that sample. So there's a bit of a rule that we talk about in statistics that a good sample will always reflect the population. And a way that I show this in my classroom outside of our training material, and it raised this very question, is I just put an example together of a university campus, completely hypothetical, where they've surveyed 200 students and asked them if they smoke or not, and put their gender down, so male or female in this instance. And then they proportion, and then what I do is we can work out a kind of a real proportion of that. So I calculate what the real proportion of how many the males smoke, how many the females smoke. But then what I do is I just take a sample, a totally random sample of 15, and then I work out the proportions of the 15. And they near enough line up really, really well. It's sometimes not perfect, but it's not about being perfect. No. But they line up so closely. And actually, what I purposely did in that population was there was only a few actual smokers in it. There's only a handful of like the 100, 200 that we did, and it always pulls them out somewhere. And one delegate then said, "But there's so few smokers out this. Surely that's just luck that it's pulled it out." And I'm going, well, no, because we've sampled it in a reflective way. We've sampled it randomly across a broad spectrum. We've not had a pattern to it. We've just gone completely random pluck out. And law of probabilities would say it will capture a fair representation. And on top of that, if it pulls out nothing, but that's because in reality, there's barely any occurrence of it in the population, that's still not too far off the truth.
Yeah.
You just have to take it with that bit of error.
Yeah. Okay, so can we talk a little bit about different sampling strategies then?
Usually, when we talk about, you should always have your hypothesis first of what you want to go and understand. And again, that should give you the fuel of how much data you need to go and collect. If I'm trying to measure a manufacturing process that's making hundreds of thousands of things a day, I'm going to need a much bigger sample, and my means of doing that might be different. If I'm collecting something that happens once in a blue moon, sampling strategy might not need to be anything fancy, and I might not need to do much, as long as I get a fair representation. So what we tend to do with sampling strategies is we tend to encourage predetermine what data you're going to go collect and how much is going to be useful. And often what we encourage generally is to try and do it in a fair, random, distributed way. Don't go down and collect all your data points on a Monday and then on a Friday. Collect it randomly throughout the week, and then maybe the next week, and maybe the next week, maybe the next month, so that you're not getting that undue bias that's appearing into it as well. So usually a good rule of thumb is if you can make it random selection, that's quite good. The only time it might not be random is if you've got a reason for it not to be random, i.e. you want to look at a particular team. So you're going to sample from that team, and then I'm going to sample from that team morning and night shift, for example, or that client and then that client. Then you can randomly select within them, but you've created a kind of strata. So the kind of sampling strategies that we use to describe these, we can have things like process sampling or sequential sampling, where if quite literally I've got things that are first in, first out on like a conveyor belt, be it calls going through a call center or product, I can basically say I'll pick every fifth item or fifth call and I'll measure that. And hopefully that should give you a good representation. I could do stratified sampling, which is where I might go, well, but within this I've got two different teams. So tell you what, I'll take 5 from team 1, every fifth one from team 1, and every fifth one from team 2, and keep them kind of separate. Now I've done a different sampling. And in effect, a lot of other sampling is going to different levels of strata over there any of the groups that you want to collect. But the safe bet is figure out what you want to find out, figure out what amount of data is going to give you a good reflection, and then where possible, try and collect that randomly across a time period so you can capture all situations.
Okay. So tell me a bit about data simulation in this context, because that's something that you and I have discussed. I know certainly that there are certain scenarios where that might be something that you would do. And perhaps if you could help our audience understand a bit more about when that would be useful for them.
Yeah, simulation is remarkably powerful and remarkably dangerous when in the wrong hands. So probably mine. But effectively, you can't get around this issue that, and this is more common in some service environments, for example, of a lack of data. And sometimes you struggle to get around that. Now, part of my argument is ultimately, if this is something that happens once in a blue moon anyway, and you've collected a lot of that, but its very substance is not a lot of it, well, actually, there's arguments to be said that it should still be representative of what you're trying to assess. You have to be careful, but you could argue, because it doesn't happen a lot anyway, you've actually got quite a good proportion of data here, even if it seems quite small. But if you're in that situation, perhaps where you have things like destructive testing, i.e. once I measure something, I can't measure it again, or you're in a situation where you are taking a sample and you really want to scale this out, so much more common in, say, academic research as well, is you could use something like simulation, which fundamentally is best for, again, places where you need lots of data and you can't get it, or situations where you can take a good sample enough and have that kind of explode out to do the rest for you and save you that time. And there's a couple of things we can do. So at Master Black Belt, we often teach Monte Carlo simulation, which fundamentally just requires you to have a sample already, understand the parameters of that sample, so the mean, the standard deviation, the distribution it follows. And if you've got those 3 pieces of information in an accurate and credible way, and they're trustworthy, I can effectively use those 3 things, those 3 pieces of information, plug it into what computers can do nowadays, and it will basically just go, well, based off that mean, that standard deviation with this distribution, here's loads of data for you. And Monte Carlo simulation does that, but when there's random probability involved, like hence Monte Carlo, like a roulette table. You can't. There's not necessarily a pattern. There's a random variation in it. So the idea is it introduces just like random probability of something happening, and then can create the rest of the data for it. And so that's one that we'll often quite commonly cover. So it's more advanced, and you need statistical software to do it. It's not something you can just, you can't do it on a piece of paper necessarily, although that I'm sure they probably did for a long time. But we've got computers now that can do this. We just have to use one that's useful for us. And one other one I would talk about briefly is one we call bootstrapping, which has kind of revolutionized a lot of data sampling, which is, if I can get a good sample of something and I need a lot of data to do statistics calculations, it will effectively constantly resample that data and keep resampling it until eventually it can almost create a very extensive amount of data from your data set by constantly resampling it. And it's remarkable how powerful it can be, as long as what you feed it is useful in the first place. So really, really, really powerful in saving you time, energy where you need lots of data, or you're in a situation where collecting data is difficult.
Okay. So essentially, different strategies for sampling in different scenarios. You need to be thinking about what makes sense. Do not spend hours just collecting hundreds of samples when actually a more contained sample will be representative. And also, in the event that you've got something that's important, but you can't replicate it too frequently for a variety of reasons, then there are simulations that can be used. And that requires software, as you say, and some expertise. But don't get stuck just because it doesn't happen very often. You can still use simulations to try and develop more understanding of what's going on.
Absolutely. And I guess the only last point I would ever mention, and because it's not the nice point to make, but quite simply, when push comes to shove, sometimes you've just got to bite the bullet and manually go and collect it. Because if that's the information that is going to give you the knowledge that you need to make a decision, surely it's worth it. People don't like that answer because they want it to be automatic. But actually, I think many of us as consultants can talk about the times that we've needed information and we've gone out and just bit the bullet to go and manually collect it as honestly as we can. But then it allows us to make those decisions. So sometimes it is bite the bullet of might be hard to go and collect or a bit tedious. But if it's going to be really useful, it's worth it.
Yes. My first introduction to sampling was we had some books published, and somebody discovered a fault in the book, a mistake. Some pages had been replicated and so on. And so it was decided that we needed to work out, and we didn't want to look through all of the boxes. So we worked on a sample basis. And I was very suspicious up front. My first introduction to it, I wanted to be that person that opened every book, although that would have been highly tedious. But like you say, the result was super interesting and absolutely representative, and enabled us to go forward comfortably knowing exactly the volume of actual errors. And
without wasting tons of time going through every single box.
Yeah. Exactly.
Makes total. That is, if you can condense all of this 10-minute podcast into what you've just said there, nailed.
Thank you again. Really, really good. Thanks for coming now.
Fantastic. No worries.
Thank you so much for joining us. You can find more episodes of our Uncommon Sense tools to improve your work forever in our Knowledge Hub on our website, or, of course, your favourite podcast platform. And do subscribe so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode, where you'll find links to more content on this topic, which includes webinar recordings, toolbox guides, blogs, and infographics, and our training page. You can always drop us a line on team@pmi.co.uk and arrange a time to have a call to talk about how these tools can help you in your organisation. We'd really love to hear from you.